this. But first of all, this kind of scenario was always in the worst-case scenario playbook of the Assad regime. This is something that goes back decades in terms of a worst-case contingency. You have a level of over-recruiting in the officer corps that is going to make it very difficult to see meaningful defections. And I like the term the FSA used for some of their units, brigades, but we should be honest with ourselves about what a brigade is. We're talking about 2,000 to 3,000 troops per brigade. The reality is that that kind of defection hasn't happened. You haven't even had battalion-level defections. You haven't had defections from many of the key units that oversee Syria's CW capability, that are really tied into its electronic warfare capability. And that's critical. You're also not going to see any defections from Alawites that actually have the metrics that matter in terms of the integrity and capability of the Syrian armed forces. It's one thing for Sunni officers, high-ranking or otherwise, to defect. It's something else to really gauge the quality of metrics they have in terms of a security apparatus that they don't control overtly. So it's going to be difficult to see that shift further. Now, there is another reason for that, which has very little to do with Syria itself and has a lot more to do with the fate of militaries in the region when it comes to other countries that have undergone both violent and non-violent transitions. On the one hand, you have the example of Iraq. Something like de-Baathification in Syria would have a deeply unsettling effect on the kinds of socioeconomic and financial networks that these folks rely on. You also have another dimension to this, which is that of Egypt, where you have a embattled security apparatus that is trying to be all things to everyone and ends up being nothing to no one, with a very questionable future amidst the flow of forces between remnants of the Mubarak regime, the Brotherhood, and some of the more stringent Salafi groups. You also have militaries that have really not recovered from the sectarian dimension, like in the case of the Lebanese Armed Forces, which still struggles with its post-war legacy. The Libyan example isn't exactly foreboding. So in all the countries where you've had tribal sectarian dimensions, where you have or haven't had intervention, but you've seen shifts in regime, security apparatuses that have their own social welfare structures don't survive, usually. So if there have been some bleeding away, there are still far too many who will tie into the regime. Now, the other side of your question is, the level of sophistication of the security apparatus's approach. Now, while I can see the Kosovo parallel, and not to make it sound too politically inappropriate, but there's also a Stalingrad parallel here too, when it comes to how the Assad regime is operating in areas like Homs or Hama. And what differs here is that there is clearly a degree of sensitivity within the security apparatus about bringing the kinds of military capability to bear that would really trigger an impromptu or knee-jerk response, not unlike the use of ground attack aircraft by the Libyans and dealing with their own uprising. So all of these factors tie in. Yes, it's a brutal repression, they're killing their own people, but we have to remember that Homs is a city of 1 million plus people, and the level of fatalities will be much higher if they brought to bear their MLRS or multiple rocket systems or heavy artillery. So this isn't to pat them on the back, nothing of the sort, but it is to show that there is still a degree of sensitivity to international public opinion, especially in terms of how their key allies, Russia and China, can continue to make the case that, look, you need to engage the Assad regime, whether we like it or not. And again, to come back to the point of humanitarian corridors, it's very difficult for someone like me to imagine any kind of humanitarian corridor or effort under the new plan that wouldn't have some kind of a green light from the security establishment in Syria. They're not to the point where they don't have overwatch, and you would have to coordinate to some degree. So again, you have a very resilient structure. They're sensitive, but not sensitive enough to public opinion, and this might be a drawn-out battle.
Your question, just to remind, I guess, that what would be if the Friends of Syria fails, if this or if it doesn't work. Now, when Turkey has started this thing on a bilateral advice and it was in good terms with the Assad regime, they thought that it was going to work and they thought that he was going to be able to change the system and still stay as president. And then with the Arab League, that the observer mission was going to work, and then we have seen all those, and with the United Nations, the Russians, the resolution was reduced to enough levels that the Russians and Chinese could have accepted. But these things happen. But regardless of what happens with the Friends of Syria, Turkey has a 911 kilometers border, land border with Syria. And nobody is moving away. Turkey is there and Syria is there. So Turkey cannot either forget about or act as if nothing happening in the region. This is a very crucial security risk for Turkey. And so Turkey will do everything to keep the focus and attention of international community, the Arab League. And Syria was never only Syria. It is almost everybody, every other country in the region, from Jordan to Lebanon, from Iran to Iraq, will be affected. What is going on and what is the situation in Syria. One thing though, what the Syrian regime believes, that they have the full support of Russia in the global level and 100% backing of Iran on the regional level. And they feel, that the Syrian regime feels, that these are temporary things, that if they can overcome just Homs, if they can overcome just this incident, and if they can go by just 3 more ones, so it is for them something that we have known this, we have seen this before, and we have survived. But other than the Syrian regime, everybody else, including the Russians and the Iranians, know that this is not something that Syrian regime had gone through past. This is different. So the international community, one way or another, for Russia especially, that since they do not, they say that they do not have any commitment to Assad family itself, that they can convince the international support to come to a reasonable level, so that some of the means and tools that are put in place could work. So that is one of the things I believe Turkey is believing and heavily lobbying, both on the side of Iran and Russia, that the situation is not what the Assad's regime think.
Thank you. So I'll take several questions. Can you state
There's a mic
your
or
name
there's a mic or
go ahead, I'll
no,
repeat
my name
it.
is Mohammed Al Abdullah. I'm a Syrian human rights activist and a researcher for the Syrian Center for Political and Strategic Studies. I want to thank everybody for the great assessment, and especially Randa for exact, in-depth, excellent assessment of the Syrian opposition. I might have a small disagreement with you regarding the Alawite figures in the Syrian National Council. I don't see any Alawite activist or opposition member has a real weight in the opposition or inside the Alawite community, because no, the time they defect or they isolate themselves.
He's outside. He's outside the SNC. Okay. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm saying none of them in the SNC. Nebras used to be.
Yeah, none of them. I said none of them is in the
SNC.
SNC.
is still
Yeah.
in the SNC though.
Yeah.
But I don't see any of them have a leverage or because the Alawite community inside Syria has been isolating anyone who's defecting from the government, including the famous actor Fadwa Suleiman, who's joined the protesters inside Homs, and they isolated her and her family, even attacked her and dishonored her. About uniting the opposition, I think that's been an excuse overused by the international community for not acting, merely because what Steve said, we don't have a plan about Syria. Go unite yourself and come back after 3 months and we will see what's going to happen. And even the opposition is united, that's not going to change a lot because Assad is not going to stop the killing. Regarding Turkey, what they can do with the FSA, quite honestly, the FSA is combined mostly from volunteers, civilians, not that much armed people, defectors from the army. And none of the leaders in Turkey has a real leverage on the people who's on the ground. They're very decentralized and they don't have connection with each other. The assessment Steve gave is very accurate regarding them. And the point regarding what Turkey can do, the Turkish government has been very talkative about Syria, and they did a great job about hosting the refugees in Turkey. However, the bad thing, from my opinion, personal opinion, that the Turkish government promises always, we're not going to do this, this is going to stop. In the few next weeks, if they did not stop, we're going to take action. And taking no action frustrated people, and have Mr. Erdogan lost the popularity he had in Syria after the case. But I have one question for Erol is about the recent visits by the Turkish Foreign Minister to U.S. Not much information about this, and one for Aram about the Iranian role in the area, because clearly changing the Syrian regime is in a favor that pushing Iran to be more weakened and insulated, but nobody approaching the Syrian profile from this point of view. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry.
In the back.
There's no microphone?
Go ahead, I'll have to repeat
Okay,
it.
I just read, my name's Mary Carrick. I just read a story that came out a couple days ago, that the guy who took over heading Al-Qaeda after Bin Laden died, I don't remember his name. As endures this regime change, having these rebels. And I've also been reading that there's all these Al-Qaeda people in there, amongst these freedom fighters. A lot of them came from Libya, because we were also endorsing Al-Qaeda people who've been fighting in other countries. And I'm just wondering, why are all these countries in the West calling for us to support this overthrow? Especially since all these minority religions could be persecuted or probably slaughtered.
Okay, the question is about Al-Qaeda's involvement in the Syrian situation recently. I'll take one here and then we'll...
Barbara Slavin from the Atlantic Council for Randa. What, in your view, could actually get the Assads to step down? Is there some combination of economic pressure or other pressure that convince the family to go into exile? Are there any potential replacements among the Alawite community or the city establishment that is supportive of Assad, like Burke or Shah?
Yes, in the back.
Okay, my name is Ali Zaza. I'm with Activists for Free Syria. I wanted to kind of add to what she said and what Aram said. He quoted that military intervention would destabilize Syria and neighboring countries. And she did say Al-Qaeda, Ayman Zawahiri declared with Al-Qaeda to intervene. I think the Muslim Brotherhood of Jordan also wants to intervene. Iran, we all know, has been intervening. So the question is, it seems like we don't want to intervene. It can cause a lot of chaos. You know, we don't want to have a buffer zone. We don't want to have a humanitarian corridor. We don't want to, Turkey, the Gulf states. So there's a lot of talk about what could happen if we arm the opposition. But what's interesting is it's going into civil war if it hasn't gotten there already. And if we don't participate, meaning the EU, the UN, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Al-Qaeda, they're already going to participate. So I think this argument that arming the opposition and intervening is going to make Syria much worse is actually incorrect, and that in the long term, Syria will be much worse if we don't do anything. So we should probably get a hand in it now, rather than let it become a playing field for Iran, Al-Qaeda, and other groups.
One there. Yes.
Sure. Sasha Simonov with the Syrian Emergency Task Force. Quickly, there's been a lot of discussion about American foreign policy towards the opposition, the revolution at large. If the United States and its allies are not going to consider arming the FSA or arming these elements, then my question is why is the State Department and why are our European allies not making a better effort to at least then support the pro-democracy elements of the revolution? Because when we approach states, say, hey, we have people, they need phones, they need help, they need asylum, they need the ability to keep organizing, the answer has been quite mute. So I just wanted to know your thoughts on that issue and that incongruence.
They need travel documents to go to Turkey.
Let's just take quick answers and then we'll try to go back. Professor Heydemann.
Fortunately, only a very few of these questions were directed to me, so I'll just make a few quick observations. I think no, I think in terms of Mohammed El Abdallah's observation about the opposition. Damn it, that just flew completely out of my head.
Uniting the opposition.
Oh yes, I think you were exactly right up to a point. It is absolutely the case that the West and the Arab League felt it was critical for purposes of legitimacy and consolidation that the Arab opposition work organically to build an effective infrastructure for the representation of Syrians in support of this uprising. I think that's changed. And I think that the Friend of Syria framework, in effect, is sending a signal to the Syrian opposition that they now have to get their act together, that an opportunity exists for them to interact at a much higher, much more tightly coordinated level with a broad range of international actors, but they now have to demonstrate that they have the capacity to serve as an effective interlocutor in this process. And if this is not a sufficient incentive for the Syrian National Council or some other set of opposition activists to respond and to figure out how to overcome the obstacles that have prevented the development of an effective representational framework, then I think it really will begin to be time to look at the alternatives. And I think the folks engaged in the Friends of Syria are aware of that, because there is also a recognition of the need to reach out to the local coordinating committees as part of this effort of supporting the resistance. I talked with a State Department official who said that we will not be limiting our outreach to the Syrian National Council, that we will be going into the Homs Revolutionary Council, that we will be working with the LCCs, that we will be looking for effective opposition representation wherever we can find it. But that too is part of a warning to the SNC, in effect, you got to get your act together. We waited a long time for you, and maybe you felt that there weren't adequate incentives to induce you to get beyond your own internal dysfunction to pull it together, but that's changed, and now it's time to move beyond that.
Let me build on what Steve has said. I don't think the SNC will be able to get their act together, given the way they are. I know. And I think that's why I think we need to move beyond an SNC pivoted strategy about the opposition and start thinking about something bigger than the SNC that will include the SNC. Now, in terms of the question, Barbara's question, what's going to take Assad to step down the role of Shara? Shara has no legitimacy outside the structure which made him as a VP, And I bet when he heard of the Arab League proposal to appoint him as, he said, why did they do this to me? Because we all know what happens to people who try to,
They commit suicide.
yeah, exactly. They commit suicide by shooting themselves in the back, exactly, or 3 to the heads, to the back of the head. So I'm pretty sure that Assad, when he read that Shara Arab League proposal, he said, what did they do to me, And he has been silent ever since, and keeping his head down. So, that's what the Arab League is saying, is that he steps aside, Assad, and gives his power to Shara. I don't see Shara as having the stamina, the gravitas, the position, the authority, the track record, whatever, the base, the political base, to be able to build this on his own. But I can see Shara playing a role in the future. That I can. I can see an Arab League kind of transition plan that would include Shara. As a way to reassure Ba'ath figures, as a way to reassure, the military. I think what's going to bring Assad to step down, I think he has to be convinced he cannot win this fight militarily. And I don't think that he's convinced. I think he and his people around him are still convinced that they can win this fight. And it's only that realization that will bring him to the negotiation table and eventually, most probably, to a Russia kind of Yemen-like, to a brokered plan similar to, along the lines of the Arab League, but which has the support of the Russians and will have the support of the Iranians. I think Aram will talk about the Iranians and about Hezbollah. I have been, studying a little bit what Hezbollah's position on what's going on in Syria, and I think, the worst case scenario for Iran and for Hezbollah is a Sunni-led regime that is hostile to Iran and to Hezbollah. That's the worst case scenario. Absent that, I think they will be able to, maneuver around alternative scenarios that will at least guarantee not the close alliance between the next regime in Syria and Iran that they have enjoyed with Bashar, but at least a working modicum of a relationship between the two that will enable to protect Hezbollah, which remains Iran's main interest.
Randa, can you address very quickly that Al-Qaeda question? What is the, we've heard some pieces of news.
This is, this is very opportunistic of Ayman al-Zawahiri to project himself as a player still in the Arab scene when the whole Arab, when all the Arab uprisings have really delegitimized the narrative of Al-Qaeda and have totally, pushed them aside. And so he has tried to, he has done that in Libya, he has done that in Egypt, and now he's doing that in Syria. Now, are there jihadi fighters coming? Yes. When I hear of calls in Saudi mosques for the support of our brethren in Syria, yes, I can see people coming to on their own or funded by some people inside Saudi. When the most surprising factor for me is the Jordanian Muslim Brotherhood. For them to come to the point of calling for support, of support for the FSA at a time when, this is a group that parted ways with the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood when the Syrians decided to ally with Qaddam.
This is partly a way to put pressure on King Abdullah, who they feel...
I fully agree with you. I fully agree with you.
There's a lot of...
I fully agree with you. I fully agree with you. But still, that kind of shift in the Jordanian Muslim Brotherhood that has, until the last minute, been a supporter of Assad for his resistance stance. That's, in my opinion, a more telling sign of the anger and the mobilization that's happening inside the Arab Sunni street as a result to what they are seeing on TV in Homs, in Hama, and others. The Sunni street is angry and actively mobilized, and we have seen what that means in Iraq, and we might be seeing the same thing in Syria.
Mohammed Abdullah's comment on the Turkey talks the talk but doesn't take the action.
With all of my respect, we really appreciate and grateful for their hosting for the refugees, but not the talk side.
You see, I understand how the friends of Turkey sets their expectations, and their expectations from Turkey, from France, from the United States, and from other countries and differ tremendously. And when those expectations do not match, and I understand the feeling. But Turkey, and again, when all these said and done, if you look at the countries who took what type of risks and what was their relationship before and what is right now, and if you run an analysis, we have to be, fair that probably the largest change in terms of policy was Turkey. And the thing is, once they have seriously and sincerely initiated certain processes, and one did not work, they did not leave any time, and they moved to the next one. That immediately after the United Nations veto, they went to Friends of Syria. Now, I know the simple logic says, arm the opposition and make the corridor, and sometimes I myself feel that way. Okay, maybe this would be easier, that you do that and then you get results. But I do not have neither the expertise nor the knowledge nor the experience of experts, both the military experts and the experts who have dealt with the opposition movements. But Turkey does not make, I know the decision-making processes, and I've lived in Ankara for 10 years. Turkey doesn't make easy decisions, and it is a process. But I'm not just saying that, I'm not alluding to it is bureaucracy. What I'm saying that once they subscribe a notion, they give a chance and wait, but they will calculate the risks also. And I know with our earlier conversations, a lot of the people who has the best intentions. They think that this should be quick because if it is a longer process, it will cost more in terms of human lives. But as Aram alluded, and I know our earlier conversations, a military intervention, probably when you calculate the number of human losses with the population density and all of those things, these are not easy calculations. And I do understand the feeling, and I tremendously respect that. But also, when the governments act, they have a certain level of constraints that has to be understood also.
Civil war already.
All right.
Saying, why not?
Well, let's go through the wild card questions. I'll do the three and try and get them as quickly out of the way as possible. First of all, the Iranian role in Syria, doesn't that weaken Iran? Iran has proven since 1982 that one of the things they're best at is fighting indirect proxy wars. And there's no reason to assume that a Syria, which is not under the control of a pro-Iranian regime like the Assad regime, will somehow magically not be an arena for proxy competition with Iran anymore. You have Iraqi elements that are tied to Tehran that are willing to play that role. Iraq's Shiite leadership has their own reasons to weaken any potential Sunni structure that comes to dominate in Syria. And frankly, the reality is that the road to hell is paved with all sorts of good intentions. And when it comes to this idea that this is going to be an easy transition in a best case scenario, even in that best case scenario, you're going to look at an environment where Iran will try to recalibrate and where this perception of a loss will gradually turn into some kind of a grudging proxy war that could last for years. And I don't see why they can't continue to support their key regional allies, such as Hezbollah, which is, for all intents and purposes, the equivalent of Sparta in Lebanon. The rumors of its weakening in the wake of instability have been greatly exaggerated. They're still a critical component of the Iranian security calculus, and they have a critical role to play in inter-Lebanese affairs as well. Now, the Al-Qaeda wild card and the future of minorities. Look, it's very difficult to look at the dynamics in Syria and in a stone cold way say that the Al-Qaeda wild card doesn't trouble any Western approach to instability in Syria. It's one thing for Zawahiri to make grandiose and pompous statements. It's something else if you do have more and more reporting from within the U.S. intelligence community and within the U.S. government structure that these kinds of presences are real, that you do have militant presences in the country. We have to remember that the fact that the Syrian regime's security apparatus was instrumental in ushering to Iraq a lot of these jihadists means that they understand the security parameters in place better than anybody else. So this does present all kinds of problems for the future. And look, again, whether it's militant jihad, whether it's proxy warfare, whether it's military intervention, minorities will be arguably some of the most critical losers. In Iraq, any minority that matters has been depleted by about 70 to 80%. That's the statistic, more or less. And that there's no reason why that shouldn't happen in Syria. And lastly, won't Syria be much worse if we don't interfere and if we don't do something militarily? Again, it's one of those things where a short-term gain quickly evaporates into a long-term muddying of the waters. And again, we don't know who the players are in country in terms of the future security landscape in Syria. We don't know whether any of the people we like will actually be in charge in a post-Assad structure. And we also have to remember another factor that really didn't come up in this discussion, which is while the United States and the West agrees with some of the key points of the Gulf-led Arab League effort, there are fundamental differences in approach between how some of the key players in the Gulf states are willing to approach a post-Assad structure and how the West might. And I don't exactly put a lot of stock in the idea that a monarchies-led Gulf structure can be the herald for democracy in Syria. So these dynamics are far more nuanced, and the instability is largely speculative today, but likely to have long-term ramifications.
Thank you very much, but I have to close and we'll continue afterwards. Thank you very much for joining us today, and